An appropriate statement on Oedipus. How could there be an appropriate statement on this person, this utter disgrace? Robert Graves, the kind of private thinker, classicist poet, had the theory of a derivation of this myth, story, background, inspiration for the tragedy by Sophocles. His idea was that there had been simply a foreign king who came to rule at Thebes, perhaps named Oedipus, who was insulted by the people for taking over the patronage, usurping the paternity of the city. Obviously marrying a local woman, the insult being, oh, she's his mother, maybe she was older. And what you have was kind of a slur that became a myth, that became a tragedy. So where did Freud get off calling this some kind of universal structure of psychology? Later psychologists and thinkers critiqued that. Some people pointed out that this was extremely useful to put the child in their place, and in later stages to put the inner child of adults in its proper place, or in its improper place, in an inappropriate place that worked for the psychoanalyst. In the power relationship where shame became a tool, psychotherapists had to do away with the Oedipus complex. But have we ever been anti-Oedipal? Because to really do that, we'd not only have to take the Oedipus out of psychoanalysis, we also need to, from Deleuze and Guattari, the refrain, world historical, not merely familial. So we need to see Oedipus, the story of Oedipus, and perhaps what appealed to Freud, what drew Freud's attention, was the power of the figure of Oedipus in world history as an emblem of a certain axialization, a certain transition from archaic religion and early civilizations to the post-axial, the last 2,000 years. Three plays about Oedipus by Sophocles, but Sophocles is first, most important. Oedipus the King. So, the King, allegory of kingship by Sophocles, based on this inappropriate slur of a myth. And even insofar as it's about kingship and the status of kingship at this Greek classic axial moment where divine kingship is being put in question. That's the axial shift. As Robert Bellah pointed out, I mean, in the turn to the archaic religions, not archaic Greece per se, but archaic religions, especially in the Near East, but also in other places, the state, early civilizations, class replaced kinship as the defining structure of society. Actually, Bellah quotes Bruce Trigger when Trigger says class replaced kinship. Interestingly, though, Bellah adds to that in the turn to these early civilizations detailed by Trigger. Kingship and divinity emerged as two parts of a single whole. Trigger's talking about class. Bellah talks about kingship. This is all on one page in Bellah's Religion and Human Evolution. Hocart answers this problem. What characterizes early civilizations? Is it kingship or class? Hocart points out that class follows kingship. Classes arose to serve the king. But then Hudson's whole point, economist, contemporary commentator, also historian, Michael Hudson, what defines perhaps the most regrettable economic transformations of the classical era, axialization in Greece and Rome? This is where the aristocracy, the oligarchs, class, no longer serves the king, but takes dominance over the king and forces the king to serve their needs, subordinates the king's protection of the people to their own class interests. That was Greece and Rome. Just a quick note on caste versus class. Caste should be connected with ritual or the persistence of ritual. Even as caste starts to erode the power of kingship, that erodes ritual, because these groups don't actually have the connection to the divine in the same way that the king did. And so more and more, this movement from kingship to group leaves convention as the more powerful force. Classes are maintained by convention. Well, why did the king become divine in the first place? There's a passage in James Frazer where he explains that in this world of the rude man, as it were, look, ritual was everywhere. So there was not this idea of like, oh, that was a miracle, whereas that was normal, it's nature. Everything was in a sense supernatural. So the king wasn't the only person who the gods entered. And this passage in Frazer isn't about kingship. It's just about stuff that seemed miraculous was actually just an extension of what was going on from day to day. Everything was pervaded by ritual. Frazer's talking about magic, and in that world that kingship emerged from, that world where the gods could enter the bodies of people, everything was pervaded by miracles. Everything was pervaded by belief. People knew what they did in the divine sense, or if they didn't exactly know, they could ask somebody, the head of the tribe. In that world, maybe there was no truth. Truth is something that comes later, once you have caste replacing not only kinship, but undermining kingship, turning into class. And then this is the Greek world, the world of Socrates, where Socrates points out nobody really knows what they do does. Maybe they can give you like a brief excuse for what they're doing, but when you do dialogue, nobody knows what they do does. Do the Greeks believe in their quote-unquote myths? Not really. Rituals have been alienated from the state because the state originated with the king's investment by the deity, which was just an extension of what was happening naturally all the time. Gods were entering people all the time. The divine was constantly having a role in people's lives. You were never going to have dissensus. The world of true ritual was a world of consensus. Any debates could be decided by God in that tribal earlier world. By the time you get to the Greeks, that's not true anymore. Convention becomes more powerful. Undermined ritual in the Greeks are in that conventional society where ritual, you're looking at ritual like, what is this? It's a Sphinx. We don't even know what it means anymore. And that's Oedipus. That's Oedipus's place as this axial figure caught between the decline of ritual and this conventional world. This will eventually become the church, where the church takes over as an independent contractor. Religion. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Oedipus Rex. It's ground zero of Oedipus, but related to the historical Oedipus. As Robert Graves said, it was a mutilated anecdote, which then shows up with this rather bizarre, but not meaningless, epithetical figuration of a foreign king. There were at least 8 or 9 plays called Oedipus, but not called Oedipus Rex. This is Oedipus the King. So really, it foregrounds something that Foucault said about drama in his Society Must Be Defended lectures. He was talking about Shakespeare, but actually he has all of drama in the picture, talking about the Greeks to Shakespeare. It's a ceremonialization of the problem of public right. Divinity and kingship at issue, public right at issue in this ceremony to problematize, throw into question what remains of the connection between political power and divine power. The Sphinx being the relic of divine power that Oedipus destroys, but also in this prophecy, Oedipus is at odds with Delphi. The prophecy is against Oedipus. Is that invented by Sophocles? Maybe it was invented in the dramas, because I don't think that was mentioned, that there was this Delphic prophecy that this basically annihilating misfortune was going to befall Oedipus. That seems to be a tragic addition. And it puts Oedipus the king in conflict with the divine. He destroys this, really the embodiment of decayed ritual and myth. The Sphinx. You don't know what it is. You don't know what it does. It's become a riddle. It's become a mutilated, malformed version of something that used to make sense. This is all grafted onto this perverted anecdote, this mutilated anecdote that's come down. This antagonism with the divine was grafted on to Oedipus, to the historical Oedipus, to the mutilated anecdotal Oedipus by the tragedians. And this situates tragedy as part of a divine festival, the ritual of the Dionysiac spectacles. And yet it's calling into question what remain of divinity and kingship, two parts of a single whole, So really Sophocles paints on this figure of Oedipus all of these aspects of what we have to include in any valid axialization. And he paints it all onto what was probably just a foreign king. And foreign kings, in a sense, were the beginnings of delocalization of divinity. The gods are no longer with your kin. We're seeing other places, other powers external to that tribal world, external to the state, the small state, the city-state. Oedipus brings that in. He's the immigrant king who, every immigrant king has to somehow naturalize himself, but this is a botched naturalization process. Of course, insanely ironically, because he was from there to begin with. So the truth of his true kingship ruins his earned or his kingship validated by merit, which is, the greatest irony, because what the citizens want is a king who has both legitimate birthright to rule and merit. So here, legitimate birthright ruins merit. So it's a complete subversion of any idea of divine kingship in that, let's say, intercity reality that the Greeks faced like no other Western society had before. Had the Indians? Well, what about Buddha? Oedipus Buddha. Oedipus Christ. Oedipus Buddha. Oedipus is wanderer and king. Buddha is wanderer but renounces his status as Brahmin, not as king, but as Brahmin. Buddha, whose very prophesized existence undermines the caste and kingship structures to Oedipus as a delocalizer, as someone who leaves. Of course, Buddha's delocalization was a fully intentional, almost self-divinization, intentional as it could be through this enlightenment. But it's against caste. He has to leave behind his caste in order to achieve that. Whereas Oedipus, his path is as unintentional as it could be. Even he has this knowledge and can't actually bring it to bear in any meaningful way. Knowledge of his own doom. Creon is really the figure of class. He doesn't have real kingship. Well, he's looking for the truth with Oedipus. When Foucault looked at Oedipus in the lectures at least 2 or 3 times across 15 years, Foucault is looking at an analysis of how truth emerges from all these different sources where you get different pieces. You get all these different pieces and then somehow it adds up. But what does it really add up to? Well, it adds up to the subversion of the king, which Creon is part of a class connected to royalty. He's a counselor. You can see why he wants to destroy Oedipus. Creon will get his in the sequel. And the sequels where Oedipus's sons, almost like Cain and Abel, are faced off against each other. Cain and Abel 2.0. In the world of Axial, post-archaic religion, the drama of Cain and Abel is done over again. No longer in the early Neolithic, now in the state post-early civilizational, the Axial state. The world of convention. Cain and Abel in the world of convention. Eteocles and Polynices. And now there's a sister to observe and comment and live through the tragedy of the two brothers locked in status-driven murder. And this seems like actually the mutilated anecdote of Oedipus was carried along actually with 7 Against Thebes, which is an amazing battle story. And it's in both of the non-Sophoclean Oedipal tragedies. Big in 7 Against Thebes by Aeschylus, but then in Phoenician Women, oddly titled by Euripides, the Battle of the 7. Polynices is on the outside. Recruited warriors attacking 7 gates of Thebes. Eteocles is on the inside. And in Aeschylus especially, it's the dramatization of ritual. It's a preservation of ritual through imitation on stage. And this is in Aeschylus overall, whereas by the time you get to Euripides, Aeschylus was first, Sophocles kind of in the middle, and then Euripides at the end. And Nietzsche lamented that Aeschylus was so much better, so much crazier, so much more ritual, so much more catharsis. Whereas Euripides is like an analysis, and really Phoenician Women, like actually he gives Creon really gets it in Euripides because he's given what he has to do. Tiresias comes back and he says, yo, you have to kill your son to save the city from Polynices, who's attacking outside with the 7. And Creon won't do it. So doesn't that just fly in the face of Creon's loyalty to the city, this apparent pious patriot of the city. Tiresias, after you have the Delphic prophecy, after you have the Sphinx, all of these figurations of ritual in its degraded state in conventional societies. Tiresias, but he's also critical to just the whole function of the play, in that this play, Oedipus Rex, is about the misuse of the Delphic oracle by the royalty of Thebes. We have the first oracle saying we need to get rid of the murderer of Laius, who's living in Thebes and bringing a curse and a plague upon the city. Creon has gone to do that and comes back and tells Oedipus, and Oedipus is like, yeah, we got to do that. It's Tiresias' arrival where Tiresias basically says, hey, Oedipus, you're the tragedy here. You know that you're supposed to know that Oedipus is in trouble when Tiresias shows up, because everybody already knew the story, and it's the reaction of Oedipus is actually D.A.R.V.O. Deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. Even though, was Oedipus actually innocent, as some modern American commentators have said? In any case, he starts to blame Tiresias, which, I mean, if this was a film noir, and Oedipus came in, and you could definitely do a noir where, like, actually he was set up. He was the fall guy for Creon and Tiresias' plot to get rid of Jocasta, magically got rid of this crazy cult thing going on outside and take over the city, which they do, and everybody goes along with it. The plague, well, maybe it was a biological weapon. Avant la lettre. You know, it's a train wreck. Just like all great film noirs are train wrecks, so is Oedipus Rex really a train wreck. But the oracles structure everything. Not only do the oracles structure everything, but they are what's going wrong here. Jocasta comes in and says, basically, hey, prophecy's crap. Who cares what Tiresias says? We had this prophecy back when Laius and I, before we had a kid, that said he was going to murder Laius. Oh, that's interesting. And then Oedipus is like, well, you know, I had this prophecy that I was going to kill my father and sleep with my mother. Funny, huh? So interestingly, in the play, the prophecies appear out of order. You hear the last one first, then you hear the first one, which happened before Oedipus was born and then was taken out to supposedly be killed, but then was saved by shepherds who didn't want to murder him, a baby. They brought him to Corinth. He became a prince in Corinth, was raised as the king's own son, even though his feet were injured, swollen foot. His parents stabbed his feet, kind of like Jesus, right? More on that later. And then Oedipus's own debacle at the oracle, where he goes in and people he's been hearing that he's not actually the son of the Corinthian king. Again, virtually all of this probably added by the tragedians. It's Oedipus's own debacle at the oracle, which is the most blatant violation of the Delphic maxims, the top three. Before you go to divine, know yourself. Okay, Oedipus goes and basically says, who am I? When Laius and Jocasta go and say, hey, or they're not having a kid, so they kind of say, hey, what if we do? Or there's attestation to what the oracle's response was, at least for the purposes of Oedipus Rex. But what questions did they ask? The most mysterious Delphic maxim is, it's often just make a promise and trouble is at hand. But a promise brings trouble to hand, gives the sense of divination to be viewed in terms of what Machiavelli says about wisdom. Divination can bring wisdom in the Machiavellian definition, which was wisdom is the ability to see trouble and to choose the lesser of two evils. So if divination, by asking something, the appropriate question, one finds a view towards trouble, one can then choose the lesser of two evils. And it brings trouble to hand, because even if there's, like, say, an auspicious, like a lucky reading, there's then the trouble of preserving that luck, preserving the path to that luck. So divination is a promise. Going to Delphi is a promise that you are going to abide by and listen to the answer, the response that you get to your question. If the question is poorly formed, as it was for Laius, Jocasta, and Oedipus, what you can expect is trouble that won't be helpful, in a sense. Bringing trouble to hand will actually be bringing a curse upon oneself, rather than bringing trouble to your hands so that it can be sorted out ahead of time. Well, also worth considering here is divination is just like what William Burroughs said about the cut-up method. When you cut into the present, the future leaks out. Is that a good thing? That's a terrifying thing in some ways, but it's a way to deal with trouble by choosing the lesser of two evils. Potentially useful question, maybe paradoxical, is, was the prophecy true before it was actually requested? Were the words of the oracle true before they're actually asked for it? You definitely can't verify that the answer is yes, because it's only when you've asked for the prophecy that you can then know later whether it... You see what I'm saying? So this is, again, when you promise to the oracle that you will live by the prophecy, you bring trouble to hand that otherwise would not be in your hands. There wouldn't be this burden of some kind of a knowledge. And curiously, so Freud looks at this, he's seeing just the structures of a kind of aggression towards some aspects of the caregiving unit, mother and father in this case, and some aspects of need to love, dominate the other half, the mother. But this is like childhood predicts adulthood. So there is a sense in which I think Freud wanted, if we could interpret what Freud might have been trying on a deeper level to do, it was to replace this crisis in ritual with something that is kind of a prophecy. Childhood predicts adulthood. Okay, what you can read out of a person's childhood experience will predict their adult responses, including into the future. And there's a reality to that for sure. And that's the great discovery of psychoanalysis, again, is this childhood genesis of personality. But to say that then needs to be a replacement for what ritual and specifically oracles or prophecy were at that time, or what they might still continue to do. Well, Freud never, to my knowledge, explicitly figured it, what he was doing that way. But that is kind of what culture has done in so many ways. The Western culture has done is to put these sciences of behavior and personality definitely prioritized over ritual, or even over historical knowledge of what ritual might have been. Freud did care about world history, but he basically projected back on world history his schema, his familial schema, and then saw it in primitive tribes, Moses. Ironically, though, he takes Oedipus as the schema, but then doesn't attempt to put Oedipus in world historical context. And what Freud was looking for in tragedy, when this whole work of looking at the childhood happens, the child, who any person reflecting on their past they were a different person, and they felt terrible. I mean, being an infant feels terrible. Being a small child feels terrible. And the target of those horrible emotions are the parents. But at the time, that infant didn't even know who their parents were. So that is kind of like this very Oedipal experience. You wanted to destroy destruction rather than aggression. Destruction. You were engaging in destruction. That's Winnicott's term. With the target being, well, it could be father or mother. Beyond anything that we can remember. A child feels this towards their caregivers, even when the caregiving is good enough or above good enough. And if only we could have known, we would have recognized the targets of those emotions as our caregivers. As in Oedipus's story constructed by the tragedians. What they created was something that was, in a sense, that feeling of not being able to remember who you did this to. It's very uncanny. Unheimlich. But in Oedipus, his caregivers were actually trying to kill him, right? Vernant had a critique of Freud. Vernant critiques Freud that he didn't understand that this was basically about the political dimensions. Oedipus the play, Oedipus the tragedy was about its political dimensions much more than anything that was drawn up to slander Oedipus, really. It was world historical more than familial. Vernant expressed that as a classicist, looking at the origins of psychology. And then more recently, that was generalized by Richard Seaford, where he's just this is all about a critique of kingship in many ways, focusing more on Pentheus. Actually, it was Deleuze's introduction to Vernant. It tells you where the Greeks really lie in the transition from archaic religion to modernity, where there's a crisis crisis of authenticity. That's Deleuze's introduction to Vernant, but there's this idea of spiritual exercises in philosophy. Tragedy, I mean, it's not exactly a meditatio malorum because you're not thinking about it happening to yourself. It's actually a spiritual exercise in empathy. So it's appropriate that Freud went to this because empathy, Einfühlung, the basis of Freud's discoveries as analyst was this Einfühlung, empathy, and what his discovery was the childhood genesis of personality. So if tragedy was the origins of a spiritual exercise in empathy in a society ruled by convention where there are rituals to structure through concepts of the divine, any theories of how the person emerged, where those were failing, and you get this spiritual exercise in empathy, tragedy. Whereas in, Nietzsche's favorite, Aeschylus, it's like an attempt to revive ritual through its imitation on stage. And what was great about Euripides, expressions, understanding, this is the dialogue of tragedy. In Euripides, you get actually, this is an exercise in empathy. All the things that the person would think going through the situation, they express, and you have to deal with it as the person viewing it, reading it. The discovery is the childhood genesis of personality. What Freud tried to find there, but it maybe wasn't there yet, actually. Oedipus has to go back to his childhood to find out what happened. Okay, well, does he actually find that the way that adults treated him formed his personality and his response to future circumstances? This is the psychological insight. This is what put psychology over philosophy, that philosophy had never understood this. The inner child, which has only been developed, freed from the mythological, the misinterpretation of world history that was Freud's Oedipus in contemporary psychoanalysis or psychotherapy. The inner child that every person brings with them that was shaped by the way that people treated them, not by anything that they did, not by them killing their fathers and their mothers. They were shaped by the way that adults treated them and responded to them, showed empathy to them or not. Well, if you want to talk about real aggression towards a parent and child versus parent, it's Orestes who is the much bigger figure in tragedy, who really bears out the legacy, mythical legacy from Homer in the Iliad. It's Orestes in the Oresteia who has to avenge his father's death by killing his mother. It's almost like Freud saw that tragedy. It's really about Orestes and killing mothers, and was just so insistent that he had to go to Oedipus and see in this, which the whole story of Oedipus is that he wasn't actually trying to be aggressive towards his parents, and yet still it comes on him at the end that in a sense he gets blamed for his parents' mismanagement of prophecy, their maladaptive response to the prophecy. Do we see a dark precursor, a figuration of psychoanalysis avant la lettre in tragedy or in this classical Greek context somewhere? Tiresias. And Tiresias isn't just in Oedipus, although this is probably one of his best roles. Ovid, quite some time afterwards, takes Tiresias and creates Narcissus, who we associate with the Greeks, but our Narcissus is from Ovid. And Tiresias says, as long as he never knows himself, he will have a happy life. Oedipus was the opposite. He refused to follow the Delphic principle of know thyself. Before you seek divination, know thyself first, then ask. But Tiresias, from Oedipus to Narcissus, this is replayed in modern psychoanalysis. Freud's was the Oedipal. Well, Freud talked about narcissism, but Kohan took it to a whole nother level. Well, who is the real... Wait, is Oedipus modernity and Narcissus is a figure of post-modernity? Greece, Rome, Sophocles, Ovid. From Oedipus Christ to Narcissus Buddha. Narcissus falls in love, or he can't stop looking at his mirror pond reflection. So wouldn't you say that psychoanalysis's misrecognition of our modern selves in the mirror pond of ancient myth is itself a symptom of our modernity's traumatic estrangement from historical ritual? Myth, it's a word that has perhaps lost its true meaning. Well, tragedy too, in philosophy. These words have all come down to us. We're using them in a degraded way. Tragedy is something bad happened. It's like a sarcastic mutilation of the very word. What we call philosophy, contemporary philosophy, what they had been meaning to mean. And this is something in Hadot and Foucault, they have these statements. Myth, yes, queer word. Robert Graves again points out that Narcissus is not really a myth, or was not properly a myth for the Greeks. Myth had a specific meaning. He actually disambiguates myth from a number of other things that we have today lumped together into myth. But specifically, myth was a way of narrating rituals in ancient Greece. So in a sense, myth was the counterpart to ritual in the same way that ideology is the way that we tell stories to ourselves about convention today in order to explain and rationalize or make them seem like rituals, make them seem like standards that reflect some kind of good or greater good. In other words, make conventions into traditions. Myth was the story told that grew out of a ritual, the power of which people believed in, but as those rituals withered away, we were left with this idea of a myth, which some people would equate myth and ideology today. Like that's almost like what happened in Roland Barthes' mythologies. Like he's talking about myth, but isn't this ideology? But in a way, wasn't the king then kind of a living myth in his real origin? He was like a living, breathing myth, an embodiment of divine ritual, narrating himself as divine ritual. Hocart had said that the first kings were dead kings. You can see how a dead king could become some kind of a myth where people do rituals in his honor. But a real king would have been a living myth in the particular sense of this narration of ritual, where the Greek word comes from. I mean, Oedipus started as a depiction of the failure of a king to use divination, or the failure of a royal family to use divination, in much the same way that the Bacchus, evidenced in Euripides, but it had been around for a while, was about Pentheus, king, who wasn't able to show adequate reverence for wine, and ends up being torn apart by drunk women led by his mother, possessed by the gods. In much the same way, it was a critique of kingship's estrangement from ritual, Oedipus, divination, Pentheus, wine as ritual object. But Oedipus became much more than that. Actually, René Girard mentioned comparisons between Christ and Oedipus. In the Byzantine world, this was commonplace. Girard obviously is interested in the scapegoat, another word that comes down to us with a meaning that maybe is not exactly what it was. Obviously, the scapegoat was a goat who was sacrificed to redeem the sins of the city. A scapegoat is a person who's actually blamed somehow. So it's sort of like a twist, like, yeah, the scapegoat is innocent too, but he's not seen as innocent, whereas the goat was seen as innocent, I think, in the original Jewish use of it, as it's reported in the Old Testament. Oedipus, kind of innocent. Socrates, kind of innocent too, right? Or totally innocent. Christ, innocent too. And yet they all take on the sins of the community. Well, Oedipus takes on the sins of his family. Their misuse of divination. Sins in the sense of misuse of divination. And again, I think Girard is the person who talked the most about imitation. What if we historicize that? Okay, it wasn't that all societies have always been based on pure imitation. There was a kind of authentic belief. When you were in a tribal society, or maybe in some of these first centuries, or even maybe millennia or two of these great societies where divine kingship persisted, where life is governed by ritual, where you're never going to meet someone who's going to disagree with you about what you do does, in the most important divine sense. Empathy was easy. Empathy was a given. Emotions were conducted through ritual. I mean, does that mean that nobody ever got upset? Well, I'm sure no, but Stephen Porges apparently has a book where he talks about the change from ritual societies that used co-regulating mechanisms like music and drumming, how they shifted, how that form of ritual shifted to societies that used ritual fear to maintain control. I would question whether there was a hard and fast shift, but maybe instead saying that there are rituals that engage like emotional co-regulation and love, and those that engage in fear. I mean, was there no human sacrifice before great societies came on the scene? Now it seems like there was certainly human sacrifice and war and fear and terrible gods. But maybe there was a shift where one became more dominant as great societies, states, kings, castes took over, a shift towards fear-based rituals. Empathy used to be something that was social and sacred, and perhaps everything that we think of as culture revolved initially around preserving that. Now it's become more of like a choice, or maybe an ability certain people have, or a skill that can be developed, tactical empathy. Maybe we could go a little bit further, empathy as a way of life. And with that, no longer just an investigation or a treatment, but empathy as a way of life. As I mentioned in one of my previous videos, the ultimate goal of ethics is to become an expression of God, or an expression of the will of God. But then wouldn't we need kind of empathy with God as a way of life? And empathy with others then becomes something in service to the will of God. Empathy with others in service of empathy with God as a way of life. Find something in not only Deleuze's Spinoza, where he talks about becoming an expression of God as the goal of ethics, but in Stoicism there was kind of a precursor to that, this idea of you need to will the moment of what comes to pass insofar as it comes to pass. So God as nature, what God does, you need to know that, will that. But there's not much in Stoicism about empathy in service of that. So can that be an axial, post-axial theme? Even Arabi, with his kind of love of God. Zen. Empathy and Zen. It's funny, actually. In an alternate translation of this opening koan, it's in the earlier one, on Blue Cliff record. It's not an appropriate statement, which kind of sounds like, a whole life is building up towards one statement. In the Southern translation, it's like a whole life's work is to be appropriate with anyone. The ability to be appropriate to anyone as you live. And perhaps that is the empathy with God as a way of life. Empathy for someone. I empathize with you, right? With and for. Empathy with God sounds better, but empathy for someone else seems to sound better. Oedipus is actually redeemed in Sophocles' play that he made after Antigone, but it's a sequel that's set before Antigone, and it's Oedipus goes to Colonus, which is actually Athens. It should be Oedipus at Athens, and it's a celebration of Athens' ability to accept exiles, and it's done through the figure of Theseus, who's kind of like the founding figure of Athens, the founding hero who, killed a monster. But here, he is able to act appropriately to the most inappropriate disgrace of all, Oedipus. Theseus offers him asylum, defends Oedipus and Antigone, and he sends Polynices away. They want to take Oedipus back to be buried, like, in some way that's going to help them win. That's whatever's going on in Thebes, they're all going to die. But Oedipus is saved and given a place to be buried. So Oedipus stays in Athens, but then he doesn't even have to be buried because he ascends into heaven. So there's definitely some Christian stuff there. Also, we imagine probably that modern cinema and television inherit the legacy of tragedy, but maybe that's not true at all. Maybe they more inherit the legacy of human sacrifice. in a modified form. Because, tragedy was an exercise in empathy only insofar as the characters are constantly describing their emotions and relating it to general human conditions. These are more of like speeches. There's a lot of rhetoric. It's not realistic. People are saying things that they would never say. That's what Tolstoy complained about Shakespeare. People would never act this way. People would never say this stuff. He knew they wouldn't, because that's not what it was. This wasn't a fictional attempt to recreate like behavioral norms, the novel. It was a ceremonialization of public rights, as Foucault said. So does cinema and television inherit that? Doesn't seem that way. Like when Benjamin says that mechanical reproduction promises to free art from its parasitical dependence on ritual, because ritual was tied to the originality, the uniqueness of art objects, cult value. Isn't this really an underappreciation of the importance and power of ritual? What about tragedy? Tragedy as ceremonialization, ritual, navigating ritual through this world where it's no longer pervading everyday life, and what he may actually be promising. Art freed from ritual becomes unrestrained impulsivity, unrestrained sadism, possibly, embodied in the media object. That's much more powerful, which makes sense, because negative emotions are much more powerful than positive emotions of empathy. Those have to be cultivated, and they were cultivated in a social fabric in our ancestral tribal world that succeeded for so long. But have we lost that? And isn't Oedipus the disgrace a literalization of both that loss and the hope for salvation and redemption? And maybe we can still have that. We can only avoid the pitfalls of worshipping some Oedipus Christ or trying to emulate some narcissist Buddha, then, insofar as we will the present as ritual in and of itself. A kind of amalgam of Zizek's distillation of Zen and Deleuze's distillation of Stoicism. There's hope, but not for us.